It's going to be Zoom.
And we'll get a chance to look at those today virtually through the conversation, but as Christy mentioned, do make a point of getting to Traverse City, getting to our galleries there and seeing these works in person because they really shine. This exhibition is titled Lustron Stories, Americans at Home. The exhibition came to Cricketry via a proposal. Charles shared his work with us, and I was immediately taken with so many aspects of this work. It is fundamentally beautiful. If you look at the each composition, each carefully crafted image is so thoughtfully composed in terms of shape and line and all those beautiful formal components, especially the colors, so much so that when the painting, or excuse me, when the photos were laid out in the gallery before they were installed, someone assumed they were paintings because they were just so delicately composed. So I really appreciate that. But I was also really drawn to this work because of the content. So Charles will get a chance to tell us about that. But I think those of us residing in these communities in northern Michigan understand the kind of housing challenges we're facing in our region, but certainly across the nation. And I think it's really interesting for us to look at these images of these 1950s kit homes and think about this idea of accessibility and home ownership and, quite frankly, economic class in the United States. So not only are we looking at beautiful work, we're looking at this very thoughtful work. And I am really delighted to welcome Chuck to our virtual platform here today to hear about his thoughts about the work and how it got started and what's so important about it. So with that, please join me in a virtual welcome for Charles or Chuck Mintz.
Thank you. Who's going to run the slides by here?
I am.
You're going to do it. Okay.
And you just tell me when you're ready.
Yeah, go ahead and show the first slide.
Okay.
The title. I'm going to, while Christy's doing that, I'm going to really give this work in context with my work and kind of how I go about it. And then once we go through some of that, talk about this project in particular. Okay, next slide, please, Christy. This is actually a detail from a project I did on foreclosed homes in every neighborhood I ever lived. There are 4 images and they're actually printed on, there's actually 12 locations. There are 24 photographs of 12 homes in all of these neighborhoods that are printed on canvas. And one of the images is screwed to a 4x4 piece of CDX, the material you use to cover up boarded up homes, and the other is made into a window shade that pulls over it. And on the side is information about the place. And the roots of that project were my childhood home, which you're looking at, which was an 1,100 square foot bungalow, not made out of steel, in Cleveland Heights that had been foreclosed. And I would bike past it, and I saw the sign in the window, the HUD sign in the window, and said, you know, what's going on here? And that sort of led me to do this whole project. You can see that this was the pinnacle of my snappy dressing. It's become worse and worse. And one of the importance of this project is I exhibited this at the History Center. And in doing that, they mentioned a 5-year project on the 50s that they were doing, and they were going to assemble a Lustron house in their facility in Columbus. And they gave me their journal at the time, which they no longer publish, with a long article about this company. Next slide. I have no idea why this is a picture of me when I weighed 300 pounds in Yonkers, New York, taking a master class. We'll come back to the History Center, but I've taken a handful of courses over the years in photography, and that's mostly the extent of my training. both in community colleges. This one was done at Parsons School of Design in New York. And my work then was largely impersonal photography, but you can see there's a little difference going on here because these kids would not allow me to be impersonal. Once I started doing this full time 11 or 12 years ago, all of a sudden everything got very personal, and real people in real situations, recognizable situations. Next slide. And you can see this impersonal stuff. This is actually the shore of Lake Erie, which looks not unlike the shore of Traverse Bay. Next slide. The first project I did was the foreclosure project, but this was the second project I did. And this is about as personal as yet. This is my son who has autism. And when he was 15, he was diagnosed with scoliosis, and he had to have surgery. And because of his communications limitations, I mean, he talks but he's mostly nouns and verbs. And we had been protecting him for 15 years, and all of a sudden he was going to get hurt. He was going to go in and come out of surgery and be in pain. So we bought a Polaroid camera. And he started using this camera. Originally, we had pictures of the cute nurse and all of that. And then he started using this camera at every family event, at parties, with these extremely carefully annotated notebooks that he would make. And this is entirely his work. And when we exhibited it, you can sort of see behind this, in the translation, it got lost a little bit. But he made these Polaroids, and this writing, everything is his. He takes the pictures, he puts the albums together. I actually think he put the pictures in the order in the albums that they were made. And it's like the ideal family album. And there's absolutely no evidence that he sees it that way. And rather, it's sort of a catalog of his life for him. His perception is very different than ours. And so I did a project of him and his albums. And these photographs are individual ones that are 64 inches high. So when you look at the albums, you can see the pictures in them are actually Polaroids. Next slide. And so here they are in an exhibit. And he's cut out, which is intended to make him a little intimidating. Because frankly, when you're dealing with someone that different and their world is very different, it can be pretty intimidated. And you talk about empathy, you can't put yourself in the shoes whose view of someone whose kind of neurological perception of the world is different than ours, but you can be respectful of that. And that's what my work is about. It's about being respectful of things that maybe you don't understand. Next slide, please. And so the way this stuff works is I come up with some sort of idea. In Lustron Stories, it was the question that this thing raised about who actually lived in these houses. When these things were built between 1948 and 50, the advertising was aimed at the Leave It to Beaver family, right? Every family was white. It had a mom, a dad, 2 kids, a dog. There were no people with disabilities in 1950. They didn't exist. When I went to elementary school, and the other thing, of course, was I was born in 1948, so this is my lifetime. But there were no handicapped people when I grew up. They were all invisible. Now, the fact is there were. So I wanted to see who lived in them. I had no idea what I would show. So this is not me photographing environmental destruction or socio-economic class. This is me coming up with that idea and letting the pictures kind of show what they showed. And then you need a way to look at them. And that are you going to take pictures inside houses? Are you going to use the big wooden film camera that I used? Are you going to use a digital camera? Are you going to print them 6 feet high, or are you going to print them 3 feet wide, or are you going to print them 2 inches wide? And how's it going to look? In this case, the last part of that puzzle piece was the frames. I found a company to make frames out of the same material the houses are made out of. So if you get to visit the exhibit, the frames, which kind of just look like white frames, are actually the same porcelain enamel steel that was used to construct the houses. And then when it's all done, you kind of say, okay, do people look at this, including me first, and kind of get a feeling out of it? Because I want people's hearts to be touched, because until your heart is touched, you never changed your mind about things. People don't change their minds because of logical thinking. They change their minds about how they feel. Next slide, please. So this is the exhibit I talked about foreclosures. And this is actually Ann Arbor, Michigan, of all places. We lived there for 4 years. And I was actually working. I was not going to school. It was after I graduated from college. And my company had a plant south of Ann Arbor. I did take some graduate work at Michigan at the time, which was at the time they had made marijuana use a misdemeanor. So when you'd walk across the quad, it was sort of an experience. If you look at this, there's a window shade that pulls down over this, which is another thing. And you can see the little pictures of me, fat me over in the corner there. Next slide, please. This is a project I did with Cleveland Public Theater, which is in my neighborhood, of actors in costume and in their homes. And the idea was here was to kind of explore the difference between someone who's in a place where they're acting, and they're in a place where they're being photographed, but they're actors. So you kind of don't always know whether they're showing their home to you or whether they're showing kind of what they want you to think about their home to you. This young woman actually still lived with her parents. When I first met her, I was concerned she was old enough to sign a mallar release. She was actually in her 20s. And Public Theater does experimental things, community theater. They're an incredible organization, but you can see the costumes are relatively modest. This is not The Lion King, but still they're costumes, and this is the stage. Next slide. And the next major project I did, which was my second book, the first book was on the album project, was Precious Objects, where I had people come and bring things they've had a long time that have special meaning that they would not replace if they lost. And then I had them write about them. And my original thought was, next slide, please. I would kind of contrast these emotionally tied items to consumer things. So I would sneak into department stores and photograph kids' dresses or the perfume counter with a little camera. So I was and I would keep doing that until they threw me out, and they usually do that. They would come up and say, "Can I help you?" And I go, "I was just looking for," and I run like hell. But you can read Roxanne's story and see that this is more than just a thing she kept. And that's what drives Precious Objects, is these stories. And again, I learned this afterwards, that everybody has. And we never know when to stop and listen to people's stories. Next slide, please. This is the project that I did after Lustron Stories on hardware stores. And the Lustron Stories was done with a 4x5-inch film camera, a wooden camera, which I used specifically to kind of make the subjects comfortable, because when you walk in with a clumsy, stupid camera like that, it's not like having a camera stuck in your face. All of a sudden you go, it's charming and people relax. And one of the hopes is when you look at the images in this project, you can see that these people don't really look like they're posing for the camera or being attacked by me. This project was done with this was an 8x10 film camera, which is incredibly stupid and heavy and clumsy. But I wanted to show these stores, and again, you can read with it from what you want, but I see this contrast again between consumer culture and making things and fixing things. And I think making things and fixing things, which was really not very important in this country for the last 30 or 40 years, people are beginning to understand that, if we don't have people making and fixing things, kind of who are we? Next slide, please.
Before we go to the next slide, I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking for your reflection in that mirror in the corner, because having been in your, in the space of your work, I'm looking for all these clues. So I'm just gonna tell you, that's why I was doing a nice little scroll on this slide, is because I was looking to see if I could see you photographing. So
Yeah.
I will switch it to the next slide, but I just had to comment.
There's one image in Lustron Stories, which I don't think is in this slideshow, of Pat C with her wall kind of all festooned with family pictures and items and stuff. And there's a sort of a typical bookcase, which was part of the design of the Lustron homes, with a mirror in the back. And in the mirror is me with my camera. So
people, this exhibit has been very engaging. People feel very compelled to come and talk when they've been through it and share a memory of some sort. But yes, they're very proud of themselves when they can come in. And it's not that I've sent them on a scavenger hunt to try to find you, but they do like to tell me that they have found you. Like, I know where the photographer is. So all right, I'm gonna switch to the next one so you can continue.
Well, I like photographing myself because I never complain about the picture. This is the project that I was working on when COVID hit, of librarians with favorite books in Carnegie libraries. And of course, the one of the great ironies, synchronicity, whatever you want to call it, is of course both of Crooked Tree's locations are in former Carnegie libraries. These are active libraries. This is a fellow in Goldendale, Washington, a city of about 1,800 people. And one of the things that absolutely amazed me about this project is I have photographs in Cincinnati and Washington, DC, and Pittsburgh, big cities with, Cleveland used to have 1 million people, but that are Washington still does, and cities with 2,000 people with active, engaged libraries. And that's so much. Another piece of culture that I think we've sort of looked the other way at is public space. And you could argue the public libraries are one of the few remaining places where we all get together as a society and a country, and everyone can take advantage of it as they feel is best for this, whether it's a beach or a library. Next slide. So we get into Lustron Stories, and this is one of the original families. Bob and Minerva bought this house in 1949, I believe. And Bob was the classic 1950s handyman. He was the guy that Popular Mechanics was aimed directly at. And so when he bought his house, he called the company and said, I don't want to put this house on a slab. I want a basement. And Lustrons were built on slabs. They were designed to be put up quickly and easily. And they could build a Lustron in 350 man hours, which is about as long as it takes me to fix a leaking toilet. And which is nothing really. And at least one of the houses that we'll come to later was purchased because they needed to move to Defiance, Ohio. They needed a house in a couple of weeks. And the contractor said, no problem, I can have a Lustron for you in 2 weeks. But Bob insisted on a basement. He's heavily added on to remodel. He paneled the insides. He actually had one of the rooms in his basement marked as a fallout shelter, which was something people did in the 50s because, when the A-bomb hit, we needed a place to go hide. And he was no longer using it as a fallout shelter, but it was the original purpose. And Bob had all kinds of hobbies. Minerva was suffering from dementia and had been sick for about 6 months. And this was an extremely touching moment in their lives and for me. And she was a delight. I mean, she would ask me the same question over and over again, which when you have an autistic son is nothing new to me. And at the end, when I was leaving, she asked Bob whether they could keep me, which is sort of a funny thing to tell a 70-year-old guy, but that's okay. Minerva has since passed away. And so sort of a lot of these stories have kind of sad twists to them, but so sweet. Next piece, next slide.
And I'm just going to quickly comment on the illustration that is behind this couple. You see what I see is so touching for everything that you're talking about today.
Yeah, with all the electronics underneath it and the like. I mean, it's just very, but you can see how personal these places all are. And everyone.
Right.
I wanted to ask a question about that personal connection. So when you title these pieces, you title them by their first names. When you share these stories, you're talking about these humans. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship that you build through this process?
Yeah, that's kind of amazing. I hate calling people or writing people, and going through the speech, hi, I'm Chuck Mintz. I'm a photographer from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm doing a project on people in Lustron homes, and I would like to include your home. And I've given that speech or written that letter. I actually have a bundle. I might even. Nah, I don't have them. But I had about 200 returned letters that I had sent to the wrong address. And when I talked to people and emails and did, everything I could to find people, when people agreed to do it, with one exception, they sort of become my friend. And they're so gracious and so welcoming. It's just stunning. And it's almost like a family. And, Facebook has a lot of shortcomings, but one of the things Facebook has allowed me to do with people who have participated in my projects, Lustron and Precious Objects as well, and the hardware stores, is people kind of were in touch on Facebook, and they follow my work, and we have conversations, and we get to know them more personally. The story with Bob is a little bit another sad story, unfortunately, but sort of sweet. When I photographed him, he's in Madison, Indiana, which is right on the Ohio River, and on the way to Louisville from here. And Louisville is the first place I showed this work. And the reason they showed it is I entered 3 of these photographs framed in sort of temporary frames in a jury photo show, and I had forgotten I entered, and they called me one day. I was actually in the airport going somewhere, and the director called and said, congratulations, you're in our show and you've won the Best of Show award. And I had actually forgotten I entered, but I quickly pretended like I knew what he was talking about. And so when I went to the opening, I actually photographed Bob on the way, which is one of the things I do with these projects. And then when this was the opening of the jury show, when I opened the real show, I sent Bob a letter inviting him to the opening, and it got returned to sender. And it's sort of, that's odd. And then I went online and found out that roughly a month after I photographed him, he passed away. And he had told me about his roof getting blown off in a tornado. And which normally is not what happens. Normally when a tornado hits your house, your roof doesn't get blown off, your house gets destroyed. But he apologized because he couldn't find the pieces. So he had to shingle his roof. And so after I found out that he had left us, I actually contacted his daughter. And so now his daughter and I are friends on Facebook, which is just kind of wonderful. Next, please. So this is one of the first ones I did, and this is in Kansas City. And Richard was a collector, and he didn't want me photographing inside because he didn't want people to see his collections, but he wanted me to see his collections. And he collected just all kinds of stuff. He had aluminum cake forms. You can sort of see one in the center of the picture behind the crossbar on the screen window. Yeah, right there. And that, I think that's a baseball mitt. So these are the forms that people would make to make birthday cakes for kids. And he had a collection of like every kind of penny ever made. And he had VHS tapes. And he said, Chuck, you can't get those anymore. And he said, people said I shouldn't do this, but I love doing it. And I said, Richard, if you love doing it, then you're doing the right thing. And retired Boilermaker with the Santa Fe Railroad. He's one of these guys that if you look at him, he could be sort of anywhere from 75 to 90. I mean, it was real hard to tell. But as I was leaving, he said, are you married? And I said, sure. And he said, here, and he had this Thomas Kincaid plate. He said, I want your wife to have this. And it's like, it's like, life doesn't get any better than a stranger who's helping you wanting to give you a gift. So I said, Richard, I'd love to photograph you with the plate out front. And he said, sure. So this is Richard. Next, please. This is a family in Canton, Ohio, which is about 70 miles south of Cleveland. And I had written her and she had written me back. And I believe the next page is her letter. So next slide. Yeah. If you just read that third paragraph, it was, again, this sort of stunning openness that and story, which, to me, kind of is a story about what's happened with deindustrialization and the economy, and then the debacle with housing in 2008 that has driven a lot of people from a place where they were comfortable and felt they were in the stream to where they're struggling to get by. And you can see they're embarrassed by all of this. There's nothing to be embarrassed by. And at the bottom, she talks about her husband being in preprint graphics, which is an industry that kind of doesn't exist anymore with digital printing technology. And so again, one of these incredibly personal stories that come behind all of these things that you don't necessarily see when you look at the pictures, but you kind of do. Yeah, next one. And this is the house in Defiance, Ohio. And this is one of probably 10, 10% of the ones I visited. where there was a community tie to the house. Either people in the community had helped them buy the house, or in this case, the owner was in a nursing home, and these were her friends that were helping to take care of the house while, while she was in the nursing home. And it was raining that day, which is the story of my life. I'm outside with a wooden camera taking pictures in the rain. But the light in the rain is beautiful. And this fellow, again, not the owner, a friend of the owner, was such a good sport. And I'm standing in the rain. They were a little bit late, and I'm thinking, great. I drive to Defiance, Ohio, which is like 150 miles from where I live, and I'm standing out in the rain with my camera, and nobody's here. But then he and another friend of theirs showed up. But again, you're really looking at this slice of America that, in a way, defines America. We're not really defined by fancy mansions, and although you can't ignore them, nor are we defined by public housing or rundown kind of, or even homeless people. We're when we think of ourselves, this is what we think about: the modest home with people who are making an honest living, who are not buying summer homes in the Bahamas, but are happy and comfortable in their homes. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the other owner in the nursing home story. Oh, and the Defiance one, that was the one where it was built in 2 weeks because her husband had been transferred and they needed a house right away. This is the bar owner, where the owner used to come for dinner after his wife passed away, and had become, and this is a small town neighborhood tavern, and they had become friends. And so when he went to a nursing home, she was taking care of the house for him. Now, think of how tied everyone is here, where this guy from Cleveland that nobody knows anything about and doesn't really say what he's going to do with the pictures because he doesn't know, asks to photograph. And she says, yeah, I'll take time out of my day and expose myself, if you will, to this stranger. And, kind of, because I have so much respect for the person that I got to know and became a friend. Next slide.
Now,
Yeah.
Chuck, would these homes would you have multiple Lustron homes near one another, or are they mostly just here and there?
So far, every one we've seen has been standalone by itself. This is in Palatine, Illinois, and there were like 7 or 8 on 2 streets. So they were fairly close to one another. There, in Palatine is a suburb of Chicago. In Lincoln Park, which is another suburb of Chicago, there was actually a cul-de-sac with 12 of them where I photographed. And Lustron was hoping to find these clusters where they could sell a lot of houses, at once. But unlike Levittown, which was one of the other big ideas and was fairly successful, Lustron's didn't require, building 100 houses at a time. And so you could, plunk one down. And so this is a suburb, but some of the Lustrons were in really very small towns in rural areas. So it's kind of special. O.M. Methling here was quite the character. He said, you don't need a hammer and a saw to work with these. You need zip screws and a sawzall to work on these things. And it's oh, okay. But again, it's kind of this piece of culture where the idea of taking care of your own home, and if something breaks, fixing it, and if something needs to be added on or changed, doing it, as opposed to going, I guess I need to move or throw it away. Next, please. Everybody is different, and everybody sees their home differently. There haven't been a lot of interior pictures, but in the interiors, you see everything from people whose homes could have been from a page of Good Housekeeping, where everything was like just so, and every, you know, and every picture was there for a reason, and everything was like proportional, and it was like a bit of work of personal art. And there were some places where it was like, really, you know, and this couple was one of those kind of reallys. Behind, next to him, are what's called magnaplanar speakers. They're 6 foot tall, like 3 foot wide, flat speakers, hi-fi speakers that uses they're a different technology. They're only about 1 inch thick. So unlike most speakers we know about that are kind of cone shaped, this was like, you know, kind of a 1950s hi-fi bug technology, and they're wonderful speakers. But as you can see, they're big. And this is the same living room area we've been seeing. And this is a wide angle lens, so it looks bigger than it is. And behind him is a screen for his projection TV. And what you don't see is, I think they had 4 dogs and 3 cats living in the house with them. And my mother's head would have blown up if you know, in a house like this. And yet it's home. It's very much these folks' home. You can kind of get a feel of the fact that it's not anybody else's home. This is these people's homes. And I was a bit of a hi-fi nut once too, and I had speakers that were too big for a house, but these are really kind of like, really, and it's like, it's you know, it's part of kind of having a successful life. And when I see these people in their homes, they don't look deceived. And there was a lot, you know, after 2008 of, you know, home ownership is sort of a fraud. It's a way to sell refrigerators, but not really. It's people do have a sense of place in their own homes. At least that's what I saw. Next slide. This is a couple in Haddonfield, New Jersey, Carl and Carl. And Carl and Carl, you can see, I mean, their house is decorated and it's nice. Now they're book people, so there's a lot of books. Behind them, kind of way in the right of the picture, is that same bookcase you see in a lot of these pictures. And this is the same wall you're looking at in the previous picture. But it's, and it's a fairly good sized TV, but it's still a much more I don't want to say normal, but you know, it's just everything is shaped and sized kind of right. Where the other house was like, I don't give a damn about shape and size. I just want what I want. I want good stereo. I want to watch my TV as big as I can make it. And I want to take care of my doggies and my cats, and I'm in. And again, delightful. And they become friends. Next slide, please.
So Chuck, I just want to ask, I guess this is kind of a standard question that comes with documentary photography, but especially in light of the earlier images you showed of the actress and this notion of the performative for the camera, and thinking about how well composed these images are. When you're working with these subjects, does it feel staged? How much are you acting? just tell us about that a little bit, that notion of authenticity or truth through the photograph.
Yeah. Well, particularly inside, there were only so many places you could photograph because I didn't bring in lighting and all of that. So you had to be in a place where there was enough light to make a picture. And pretty much the bigger the film or the bigger the sensor, the more light you need. So I didn't want the exposures to get to be more than a second or two because most people can't hold still. And so there were those limitations with things. And so I would essentially count. I'd say I'm counting to 5 and I'll take the picture while I'm counting. And that allowed me to wait for people to blink and then so I could get people with their eyes open. But I didn't tell them how to sit necessarily. And I didn't, kind of necessarily arrange them. I put them where there was light. But the camera, if you've never been photographed with somebody with a large format film camera, you can't imagine how stupid it is to have some guy with a cloth over his head looking at you through this thing made out of wood and adjusting it. It's hard to maintain your big camera grin, but I also, you don't really know how people are affected by what you say and do. All you know is the outcome, right? And in my case, I think people, for the most part, were like pretty comfortable with what went on. This is oh God, I keep forgetting the name. It's the birthplace of country music on the Tennessee, West Virginia border. And this is a young woman with a disability living in this house that they turned into a group home for people with disabilities, and her mom. And, you can get the feeling that Christy's in her home. And that's a big deal. Next slide, please.
Well, if we can pause, although my internet's slow, so I'm not sure if it's work. But speaking again about the composition and what you're doing to build this image, when I look at the colors in this photograph, they're so cohesive. I mean, it feels really like a precise and decisive palette. Is that good fortune, or did you make happen?
Well, partly good fortune, and partly I was looking at what I was doing, and partly I didn't show the ones that didn't turn out well, right? But also, these houses were really well designed, and so the colors, and this has got a bit of a pinkish hue to it because again it was raining. But the colors, this is a sand color, were sort of designed to make things look comfortable. Even though there were 4 common colors, they had a bunch of them that would show up like one at a time. But there was this sand color, there was a gray, there was blue and yellow. And the story is the blue and yellow are the colors from the is it Sweden or Norwegian? I think Swedish flag, because the entrepreneur that started Lustron was an immigrant, and he wanted the colors of his home. And I'll be honest with you, it's slipping whether it was one of the Scandinavian colors, but if you look, the one with yellow and blue in this flag, that's what we're talking about. So, part of it is just good design, and part of it is kind of looking at the right stuff. And also it's a fairly simple composition, which helps. Next. Yeah, here's a fellow in another small town in Ohio, and that table was his grandmother's, and is kind of a very typical mid-century modern table. But you can see the Lustron kitchen in the back, and that book divider, which is pretty classic for these things as well. His kitchen's been remodeled. Originally, it had all metal cabinets. These things originally had a combination dishwasher, clothes washer in them. which if you think of 1948, automatic clothes washers were new. And most people and people were just starting to buy these things. And the company that made it came up with the brilliant idea of washing your clothes and washing your dishes in the same place, which is one of those brilliant ideas, not so brilliant when you think about getting your underwear on your plates. You know, it's like, maybe not. Next, please. By the way, he had a default notice from the finance company on his house that he showed me for $16,000. And that's the other thing is the houses in the Western Chicago suburbs were worth $300,000 or $400,000. And the houses in the small towns would sell for 30. Same house. This is one on the east bank of the Mississippi that these folks are using as a bed and breakfast. And as part of the entertainment, they took those magnet poetry sets that people sell and stuck them to the wall. And one of the things about porcelain steel is it's really hard to drill holes into, because when you drill into it, the glass coating tends to shatter and break. And it also, the steel underneath is only really protected from rust by the glass. So as soon as you put a hole in it, you're in danger of rust. So people don't like putting holes in these. And unlike a plaster or plasterboard wall, you can't spackle it. So they hang things with magnets so that sign with the rules in the middle with straight up cool hand loop is hung with a magnet. And then people would come in and, you know, put their little stories on the wall while they were sipping their coffee and enjoying their Lustron experience on the overlooking the Mississippi. Next. This is the laundry room, and this is a young woman in Columbus, Ohio, and she I think she told me she thought she was the best looking woman that I would photograph, and she might have been maybe the youngest too. But she was proud of her Lustron, and you can see, even though things have been added, the washer and dryer wasn't part of the original thing. Again, the same porcelain enamel panels that you saw on the outside and being used on the inside. So they were the interior walls and the exterior walls. And if you back up a little bit and look to the right, you got the kitchen. And then if you enter the kitchen and turn left, you're into that eating area we just saw. Next. So that's not everything. And if you've not seen the exhibit, there's a lot more. And most of the ones I showed are not in the exhibit. So the ones in the exhibit are the ones I thought were better. So anyway, and better is a strange word. I do want to thank all the people that helped. The Ohio History Connection was really, really supportive, and they did get some funding, and they got the glazing donated for this thing. Cherokee Porcelain are the people that made the frames. And when you think about a business getting a request from an artist to make 25 of something that they've never made before and has no drawings and anything, the fellow running the company who also became a friend, who also passed away, but I'm still friendly with his daughter, knew about Lustron and wanted to do it and made these really spectacular frames. A dozen of these images are in the permanent collection of the Smithsonian, and you can look online and see them. And the ones online are similar to I think all the ones online are also in the exhibit. So if you can't get to Traverse City, although I'd recommend it, the fish is really good. And the Columbus Foundation did a donation, which helped to buy the frames. And the Ohio Arts Council actually gave me a grant for this. So questions?
Christy, you're muted. I know I have a delay, so I did
Sorry,
type
sorry.
into to see if attendees have any questions. So
We do have one
Are you-
question here, Liz, from the audience.
oh, okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Judy.
How many photographs did you make at each location?
Could you hear that? How many
Yes.
photographs?
I would typically, I would typically do 4 inside and 4 outside. So I would expose 8 sheets of film. When you're doing work like this with people in it, and because particularly inside, because you have very, very little slack, both on what's in focus and what's not in focus, and also what if somebody moves or blinks, no matter how tricky you get. So I did 8, and then would pick out 1, typically either inside or outside, because after you develop the film, then if you're actually going to do something with it, you have to scan it, and that's a relatively tedious 2 or 3 hour procedure, and before you do anything. So I don't finish all 8. I'll finish 1 or 2.
We have a question that's come in from one of our virtual listeners or watchers, however that we want to say. Are there any Lustron homes in Traverse City or Kalamazoo?
I mean, I don't know. They built 2,500 of them, and about 2/3 are remaining. I'm almost certain there are some in Kalamazoo. I don't think there are any in Traverse City. There are quite a few in Michigan. If you see the exhibit, there in the book, and Crooked Tree has copies of the books for sale. Just hint, 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 hint. Which was published by Ohio State University Press, which is wonderful. Thank you. But the cover of the book is in Oak Park, and it's an original owner and her daughter. And Clementine, the only thing Clementine asked the women who had bought the house with her husband, and is that I don't photograph her with her walker. And it's like, and the way I photograph people, this is not Sears, portrait studio where I'm doing things to flatter you. But if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about respect. And so I want to be respectful of people. So if somebody says, I don't want to be photographed with a walker, it's not like, well, you got to have the walker in there because I want people to know how old you are. It's like, no, it's not part of what I do. And that's a pretty wonderful picture. I also did, there's one from the north side of Detroit, right on the border with the rich places up north of Detroit, of a guy who's also become a friend of mine, Miles, and his one son at the time, Terrence. They've had another son since, and it's a fun photograph too. And it was one of the very few I found in a big city. There were some in Minneapolis, but most of these are in suburbs, which was government policy at the time to move people to suburbs, because that's where a lot of the manufacturing plants were, and they wanted people where the work was being done. And, like a lot of ideas people have, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Turned out that it wasn't such a brilliant idea. But this is in Detroit, and it's Detroit. It's the street's not bad, but you go 1 block away and you go, yeah, you're in Detroit. They went out of business. There's a lot of theories about when they went out of business. But if you're in Traverse City, I would suggest that you drive to Columbus on 2-lane highways one time, and recognize that the 2-lane highways you're driving on are in much better shape than 2-lane highways were in 1948. And they needed to drive the pieces of the house to the site. And then the trailer was a special purpose trailer. They needed to drive it back. And that's a killer. That's absolutely a killer. What would be a 1-day trip for a truck today would be 2 or 3 days in 1948. The other problem they had was all of their capital came from government loans, federal government loans. And that's a problem, because if your first mortgage is to the federal government, it's hard to get people to lend to you. And if your shareholders have no cash stake in the endeavor, it's also hard to get a bank to make a loan. So they were cash strapped right to the end. That was another problem. The third problem is that when they kind of came up with the company after the war, there was substantial excess steel capacity. And then they ran into the Korean War, and steel was rationed again. So materials that were widely available were now hard to get. So they had a lot of issues that led to their undoing.
Well, we're getting close to the end, and I thank you so much. Oh, we might have one more question, Glenn.
With the limited number of colors, was each house one color throughout, or was there exterior colors and different interior colors?
Pretty much the exterior was all one color and the interior was all one color. And if you look at the pictures, the interiors are pretty much all the same kind of cream color for the walls. And if you think about the process, they were running machinery. I mean, the idea was to be the General Motors of housing. And so they would run these panels, exterior panels, for example, through the process, which essentially is depositing what's called a bricks, which is, if you know any ceramicist, is kind of a mixture of sand and pigment on the outside of the steel, and then going through an oven where that stuff melts and attaches to the steel. And so they would, want to run all one color for as long as they could. And they also, wanted to simplify things so they could, take economies of scale, which they never actually reached in account.
Are there any other questions? Oh, we're gonna get that figured out. Liz already messaged me. We have somebody here who's got her hands marked on one of the books, so we're gonna.
Is the process the same as powder coating?
Is the process to cover the steel similar or the same as powder coating?
No, powder coating is a synthetic. It's essentially a dry paint, and powder coating lines use static electricity to hold the powder to the steel, and then they bake it, which is similar here, but powder coating is not done at nearly the temperatures that it takes to melt sand, and it's not nearly as tough, but it's pretty tough. And for appliances, which used to all be made out of this same porcelain steel, powder coating quickly displaced it because it was way cheaper. But environmentally, this stuff is actually much nicer because there's no fumes and stuff. If you've seen powder coating done, it smells. Not as bad as wet paint, but it's.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chuck, I as somebody who has had the pleasure of being at the front desk when people visit the show, I'm not saying this, to be dramatic. People have come to me at the front desk with tears, and it's been a very emotional experience for them. They're very humbled that you were able to create that relationship, to be able to go in these homes and for lack of better words, take photos where the people are very vulnerable. So you've done a really, really thoughtful job, and they're beautiful. They're beautiful.
Thank you so much, Liz. pretty much I depend on persistence and dumb luck.
Well, thank you for going out on this venture and capturing these memories. So, Liz, is there anything else you want to say?
Just thanks again, Chuck. We're looking forward to the conclusion of the exhibition with a reception when you're here to pick up the work. So,
Which I failed to mention the reception, so let me do that right now. So the reception, we have, oh my gosh, what is the date on that, Liz? Is it the, I should have that down.
yeah, November 13th.
Well, 13th? Hold on,
Yeah.
we're pulling it up right now. November 12th from 5:30 to 7 p.m. And Chuck will be here. So come and meet in person. All
Thanks,
right.
everybody. Sorry, my internet's so glitchy, but it was great on my end. So thanks for sharing, Chuck, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, everybody.